I want to read something that is an obscure, but to me a very important fact about the Glenville uprising. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I'm going to read this. It says, at 2:30 p.m. on July 22nd, 1968, Cleveland City Council member George Forbes, you know him, don't you? Yes, George Forbes. At 2:30 p.m. on July 22nd, 1968, Cleveland City Council member George Forbes and Mayor's Council on Youth Opportunities Director, does anyone know who that was? Walter Beach, former Cleveland Browns player, met with the Cleveland Police Inspector Louis Coffey at Cleveland City Hall. Coffey said that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had given the Cleveland police information that Ahmed Evans and his New Libya group were stockpiling weapons at Evans's house at 12312 Auburndale Avenue. That was the first indication. That is why, just from Washington, somebody had targeted Ahmed Evans by pure rumor. And there's events that occurred after that. The panel is going to discuss what the media was doing during this time, which was also very interesting. So let's start with that. What did the media, I mean, Dick, let's start with you. You work for the Plain Dealer, right? I mean, in fact, you were the only black reporter.
No, that's not true.
That's not true.
And I was, at the time of the shootout, I had just started with the call-in. Okay. At the time of the shootout on July 23rd, I had just started with the call-in post about 3 weeks earlier. So I was off duty. Of course, it jumped off at night, and I didn't hear about it. I was out interviewing somebody, and I didn't hear about it till it was getting dark, and they said 3 policemen had been killed on Lakeview, and I thought, well, I should go there. I thought that's what reporters did. I want to tell you, I entered Superior Avenue from 105th Street. It had just gotten dark. There was no one on Superior Avenue to be seen. And at that time, Superior was jam-packed with people and traffic ordinarily. I drove from Lakeview, I drove from 105th to Lakeview. I did not see one person. All of the street lights were out. The only illumination was from my car and from the burning buildings along the sidewalk, which were not being attended by anybody. That was the war zone the way it was that night. And, well, make a long story short, I managed to get around to Euclid in Lakeview. I had to go through East Cleveland to get there, and I walked into the shootout area. By the time I got there, I thought all the shooting was over. The place was swarming with police. There was a body lying on the sidewalk right in front of the door to the Lakeview Tavern. The police were stepping over it, back and forth. Blood from the body had congealed on the sidewalk. And I asked a policeman, who is that? So that's one of the militants. They weren't interested, dead body. Incidentally, about that, later on, they found out that this person was not connected with Ahmed Evans or any of the militants, that he was a young, hardworking man who lived in the neighborhood, a young father, and his death could not be explained. And then a few days later, they came up with the story. A wounded policeman said that this young man had volunteered to go into the shooting area where the police could not go because of the gunfire and help pick up a wounded officer, and so he was a hero. And that's the way they took care of him. And then he was killed by the militants, even though he was, where his body was lying, could not be, that didn't seem possible, and that they showed no respect for his remains until they found out they had to explain the death. He left a widow and preschool children, and what I heard from the family years later was that Blue Coats Incorporated, a business organization that said They backed up policemen, helped support the family. Had the family demanded a full justice, then there wouldn't have been any support from Blue Coats Incorporated. But that's a side issue. Oh, okay. But and what was your question again? I'm sorry. You want to know it? Okay. Well, in any case, I stayed up there in the area for several hours. I left just before Ahmed Evans surrendered, so I can't talk about that other than what I heard. But the police were trying their best to find out what happened. They were, as I say, milling around everywhere. And finally, Ahmed Evans surrendered. He had been in a house. And then, as I understand, all of the police, the patrolmen, went to the 5th District Station at 107th and Chester. They met in the basement. They said their organization, the Fraternal Order of Police, wasn't representing the patrolmen well enough. They were as mad as they could be. And that's when the Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Association was organized, to just represent the patrolmen. That anger was incredible on the part of the police. And it was known that the next night they were going to come back into Glenville, and anybody of any age was going to be vulnerable. They were out to kill. That was understood. So all the next day, community leaders went downtown to the Auditorium Hotel, which at that time was on 6th and St. Clair. They met all day long talking about what to do that night, how to secure Glenville, how to stop any rioting or anything. And they came up with a plan, which they presented to Mayor Stokes, that if all the white policemen were barred from Glenville, all the National Guard, that they would go out as citizens, a citizens patrol, unarmed, wearing orange armbands, and walk the streets of Glenville to see if they could stop the rioting. Well, this, of course, the police deeply resented that. They were as mad as they could be, but Carl Stokes did issue the order, and I think that was the most courageous, daring order I've ever heard of a mayor issuing in any city at any time in the history of the United States. Because what happened was, you did have at that time a large number of men, responsible men living in Glenville, and they came from other parts of the city to walk the streets all night long. There was looting, there were some fires, but not nearly what had been expected. However, the police, the white police, ringed Glenville in their cars. They could not come in, and there was only one band on the police radio. They spent all night long making disparaging comments about the people of Glenville and using the N-word and every other racial slur they could think of when every time they mentioned Mayor Stokes. It was clear that their hostility and rage was so great that had they come into Glenville that night, there's a good chance any number of innocent people would have been shot to death. So Carl Stokes kept them out that night, and through the next day, things were calming down. What the Citizens Patrol did was something that was almost unprecedented in the history of the urban riots of that period, which was there was less damage, less looting, less rioting on the second night than there was on the first. Usually the reverse was true. So this was a great thing. It worked. The Cleveland police were totally angry. They showed their racism, but by the next night things had calmed down and eventually got over it. However, they never forgave Carl Stokes. And when he ran for re-election the next year, off-duty Cleveland policemen invaded the polling places on the east side of Cleveland. They said they were there as observers for some issue about the 18-year-old vote that was on the ballot. And so all of these off-duty policemen volunteered to go into polls and be poll watchers for the ballot issue. And they made sure that when people came into the polling place, that their coats that were open, somehow people would see that they were armed, and they would challenge people, ask them for their identification and so on. That enraged the community so much, I think, that when news of that got out, more people came out to vote for Carl Stokes than would have otherwise, and he did get reelected. But I just bring that up to show you the depth to which they would go. And these were Cleveland policemen trying to intimidate voters and to keep them from voting. I guess I could go on for a very long time, but I won't. But I want to just say that this is so important that we are here talking about this, because another thing I did find out as a reporter is that when there is a sign of community rage, a community anger, it protects us. Whatever they were doing to us, they don't do as much of. We don't get justice, but we do get we do get a reduction in the violence when we show that we care about ourselves. And so, anyway, now let somebody else go. Okay, thank you.
And I want to add that the mayor's committee, the second night when they said no white policemen or police officers in the community, that was the only night that no one got killed. It was the only night that no one got killed. Okay, who else wants to talk about it? The report. Is it the report?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank everybody that spoke before me and thank the ones who's going to speak after I speak. I was a kid at the time. I was 15 years old out on the street. I was down at the Nationalist Cultural Center where Ahmed Evans had the shop. He taught cultural, they taught woodworking, they taught poetry, they taught, as a matter of fact, Ahmed Evans played the saxophone. I was introduced to John Coltrane at an early age, at 15. I got into jazz. But anyway, that night of the shooting, we left the shop and was running through backyards like Mr. Peary said, was no one on the street, and all the street lights was out. You can smell the gun smoke. You couldn't see anything. And we went through backyards around Moulton and Beulah through the playground to get on the scene where they were at. And as kids, we were doing some looting in the stores, and a friend of mine got hit across the forehead with a rifle butt from one of the National Guardsmen. That's how vicious they were out there, even with kids. And the committee that the mayor had signed was Baxter Hill. I don't know if few people know Baxter Hill, Reverend Randall T. Osborne, and Roosevelt Greer. He was a football player. There were a lot of the activists that was out there that was calming the crowd down and letting the people know that they were there and they were being protected. Ahmed Evans, a lot of people don't know, he was in the house of Mr. Turpin, James Turpin, and Ahmed had called several times to get the police he was trying to surrender to them, and they wouldn't let him surrender. He wanted to surrender to keep any more bloodshed, prevent any more bloodshed, and they finally, after I think the second or third call, came and he surrendered to them. But I'll never forget that night. And just thank God for Carl B. Stokes, the Mayor's Committee. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank the committee for putting this together. I've been involved in a lot of community stuff. My name is Stan McBee, and I've been on the other side of putting these things together, and it's more than a notion to coordinate all of this. So I want to thank the committee and all the participants as well, and thank you guys for coming out as well. Janice called me and James called me, so all I had to do was show up, so that was real easy. So I want to, again, thank the committee and everybody who's participating. I'm a little young to be a reporter, so I don't have the experience that Dick does here, but I have it from a different perspective. I actually grew up on Beulah, And we had a business. My dad was an entrepreneur. We had a business on the corner of 123rd and Superior, Capital Dry Cleaners. Matter of fact, we just sold that property a couple of years ago through eminent domain, but that's a whole different question. When you talk about ethnic cleansing and all of that kind of stuff. So I was a young kid, and my house, I live on Beulah between East 115th and Lakeview. And to get where that tow truck was, where some of those shots rang out, is like a 2-3 minute walk from my house. So as a 9-year-old kid, we could hear everything. All the sirens, you know, all the gunshots, all the smoke, you hear, smell all that kind of stuff. All the neighbors were calling to find out what was going on and try to get an update. We ain't have Google and all of that kind of stuff back then. And it was a scary time. And I remember when we finally could, you know, roam the streets after everything was calmed down, seeing all the spent bullet shells that were on the ground. I remember the National Guard and that police state mentality that invaded the neighborhood. And we lost a lot. As James alluded to earlier, he said it was the Gold Coast going to the Lost Coast. The neighborhood was changing. It was in flux then. But, you know, we always talk about white flight. After the riots, we had black flight. Everybody started moving out to Lynn Harbor, and everybody started moving out to Collinwood and Warrensville and those kind of things. So we abandoned our own community. And I remember my dad, we didn't own the building back then. It was owned by a Jewish gentleman who was a good friend of the family. But our building did not get touched. And I think that was a combination of two things. Number one, my dad had respect in the community. He was a political activist and an entrepreneur. And he was part of that group of men who walked the streets that night, those couple of days. And the other thing is we had a dry cleaners. I don't know if we had an electronics store. It might have been a whole different story. But our building didn't get touched. We ended up buying the building maybe 2 or 3 years after the riots. And again, redlining was pervasive. We ended up having to get the owner, again, who was a friend of the family, a Jewish gentleman. He financed the purchase of the building, you know. Owner finance. We couldn't get anything from the bank, so it was owner finance. But I do remember as a kid, because my dad always knew the importance of entrepreneurship and that intersection of entrepreneurship and politics. It's very important, and I'm not going to go off. We talked about raising money and all that. That's a whole different story. But when we were kids, and a lot of you probably experienced this as well, you know, Christmas time, family put you in the car and you go around and you look at all the Christmas lights, right? You do your shopping or whatever, go to dinner, you go around and look at all the Christmas lights. My father made a point of once you could drive through that community of putting everybody in the car, and we drove around and we saw the opposite perspective. We saw the devastation that the community went through. We saw the burned out buildings, the charred buildings. People talked about Franklin's and all of that kind of stuff. Places that we could go when we were young. And so what I realized in hindsight is that not only did we lose the infrastructure in terms of those physical buildings, because again, like this building is going to be moved. So it's going to take a demolition truck or whatever when they come out to demo this, you know, a couple of days. And like in Vegas, they can demo something with implode it in a couple of minutes. All right. But it will take a long time to rebuild it. And that's what happened to the community, not only the buildings, but to the neighborhood, the people. Because after that happened, people started moving out. So you didn't know your neighbors anymore, or they weren't there. As she said, when she went to Ken and her friends and came back, a lot of people no longer lived here. So it was a heck of a time, and you know, something that, you know, when you go through, you'll never forget that. Never forget that. But I'm glad, again, we're here and we're having those conversations and we're commemorating that. And I, too, applaud Mayor Stokes for the decisions that he made. My dad and Mayor Stokes were very close. My dad worked with Mayor Stokes when he first ran and lost, and worked with him. And when Carl came back to the city after he did his stint in New York, my dad was his treasurer when he ran for judge, and my brother ended up marrying Carl's daughter. That's another story too. But anyway, so I had an opportunity to listen to some of Carl's stories. I wasn't that close with him, but I had an opportunity to sit down in, gatherings and listen to some of his stories. And he was a hell of a man, and that was a hell of a decision that he made.
Now, Sherry has a story that is very important, and I want you to listen closely because, again, these are some of the things you don't read about in the history books.
I'll try to be brief. Since we are commemorating the unfortunate assassination of Dr. King as well as the uprising, I have to share a story with you, and I have to tell you that the ancestors had their hand on me in this instant. I went to Atlanta, Georgia, to a birthday party, went to visit the Martin Luther King National Park, sitting in Ebenezer Baptist Church, taking in the history and just trying to imagine what it was like while he was there during those times. And they're playing an audio of Dr. King speaking, and I hear the word Ahmed, and I hear Cleveland. And I hear him say how he met Ahmed and how the establishment, the black middle class, did not want him to talk to Ahmed, that he was a troublemaker, that he was a radical, that being seen with him would be bad press for Dr. King. And Dr. King said, I didn't listen to that, I listened to Brother Ahmed. I listened to what he had to say, I gave him a chance to talk. And afterwards, I shared my opinion with him. And I wanted to share that story with you because I had shared briefly before that my dad introduced them and that it was a changing point for him. But I wanted you to hear Dr. King's words, that he said he talked to him and he invited him in to the movement and asked him to give it a chance. And those were his words. And it's just because I was in that place at that time that I heard that. And it was meant for me to hear that. That Dr. King met him and talked to him, and that was a pivotal moment for him. And that goes back to the same discussion we're having about whether there was conflict. But there was. Everybody was not on board with Dr. King or with the black militants or any of that. There was not a blank, there wasn't just a group consensus that all of this is good. There was conflict. But I wanted to share that story because it still gives me chills that I didn't even know that had ever happened, that he had made that speech and that it was recorded. And if I hadn't been in Atlanta at that day at that time, I would not have gotten that story. So I wanted to share that. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to hold this, but there are some points that I think are worth making. At least they're important to me. Well, one, just as a matter of information about that surrender that Sherry described so well, the brother described so well. However, the surrender took place. It was true that Ahmed asked for the police to come get him, and they didn't do it because he originally asked for black policemen. There were black policemen at the scene. They refused to go in to get Ahmed Evans. Finally, 2 white policemen went in and got him. Those black policemen who refused were probably the smartest people at the scene, because I'm sure what was in their mind was that as they emerged from that house with Ahmed Evans, they would all be killed. But that's the way the tension was. The second thing I meant to hit on that I really think is important, we're talking about how people made decisions to move out of Glenville and all of that. But believe me, the exodus from Glenville started before the rioting, before the uprising. It was going on, it was a trickle, but people were not moving into Glenville. The professionals certainly weren't, they were moving out. I know that because I I was looking for a place in Glenville, and the real estate agent looked at me like I was crazy. Says, everybody else wants to move out. Why are you looking for a place here? That was before the shootout. The fact is that Cleveland's economy was deteriorating, and it had been for a number of years. It wasn't like it is now, but factories were closing. The money that had built Glenville, that had built the Gold Coast and all, was no longer flowing into the city. And so we want to blame everything on individual decisions, but we have to really look at what was the bedrock behind it. It was the economy. And the third thing, I guess, I was asked to talk about the news and how the news covered it. I would just say that I work for the Call and Post, so I covered it one way. But the plain dealer, the press, the television stations, they did have a few reporters by that time, not many. But most of the reporters who were covering these things out in the black community were white. They depended on the police for both protection while they were in the area and for the account of what happened. So most of what got in the papers were filtered through the police department. That's what made the independent black press so valuable.
Can I counter? I also want to say, and I'm going to make this available online, the Muhammad Speaks covered the trial and the riot. And I just yesterday with my cousin Marcus was going through my father's scrapbooks of these incidents and found several articles that were written in the Muhammad Speaks, the Nation of Islam's paper, completely different coverage. Again, like you said, the independent black press is very important. And I want to make those available because I don't think there's microfilm of Muhammad Speaks from that time available, but
That's all. I can tell you a lot.
I bet you could. I know you could, but I want to make that available because the storyline is very different. Okay, thank you.
Maybe I should mention something I'm involved with right now, and it's about this whole issue. A couple of months ago, I got a call about 10:30 at night, and it was an LA call. I was sitting at home, and the person said, may I speak to Ray Winbush? I said, this is he. And he said, this is Ryan Coogler. And I said, well, the only Ryan Coogler I know is the guy that directed the Black Panther. And he said, that's who I am. And so I said, who is this? And it was Ryan Coogler. And he told me that this is a long, complicated story, but he had gotten in contact with me through Charles King, who's a real big black producer in Hollywood. If you saw the film Thurgood, what's Denzel's latest movie, Roman Israel, and did Mudbound and all this stuff. He was one of my students when I was teaching at Vanderbilt. But anyway, Coogler said that he didn't want young black folk to just remember the Black Panther as the superhero, that he wanted it to be deeper. So next year is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Fred Hampton in Chicago. And I've been going back and forth, met with Coogler just a couple of months ago in Chicago, him and his lovely wife. And we're digging up the issue right now of how reporting occurred, Sherry. The Muhammad Speaks is deteriorating.
Yeah.
I mean, literally. It's a long, complicated story. But the idea of how history is reported, there's a Kenyan proverb that says, until lions have historians, hunters will be heroes. And we've got to tell our own stories. And most of the reporting, as we've said today, about what happened in Glenville 50 years ago had to do with the COINTELPRO period. The FBI was injecting its own to create and foment some of this stuff. Just the same way we know, and you probably know the story about Fred Hampton. His best friend at that time was the guy who brought the sleeping aids to him right before the police came in. He was working with the FBI. So that can't be left out of our historical narrative, how many of the incidences that occurred in our community were triggered by the FBI and people classified as white.